Hi everyone, welcome back to freepilotgroundschool.ca. This is one of the advanced lessons, Air Law for Dumb Pilots. And of course, I don't actually think that pilots are dumb, but it's kind of advanced topics but are simplified and dumbed down a bit for everybody. So I'm going to make a prediction. I'm going to say that this video will probably be my least watched videos. Most people would prefer to watch paint dry over doing an air law lesson. But I thought the same thing. I was in university. I had taken an aviation law course, and I thought it would be really boring. And it was actually taught by a lawyer who specialized in aviation law. And there's way more to aviation law than just the basic Canadian aviation regulations that you're used to. I mean, you can expand this to all facets, constitutional law and contract law and corporate and business law. So it's actually quite fascinating if you make it through the whole thing. Well, hopefully you learned a bit more and you find it as interesting as I do. So let's get started. We'll begin with talking about the constitutional framework of laws. And as pilots, we know most of our knowledge of the law is the Canadian aviation regulations. So, for example, what visibility you need when you're VFR, or that you can't drink alcohol and fly. What most pilots know a bit less about is the Aeronautics Act. So, the Aeronautics Act is the act of Parliament that enables the Canadian aviation regulations. And then above the acts of Parliament, we have our Constitution. So the point of this lesson, we're going to dive into this law a bit more than we normally would as a pilot. So what are the sources of law? Let's begin with that. So at the top, we can say we have our constitutions. We've heard about the Constitution of Canada, Constitution of the U.S., and these are enacted typically by the founders and require, or maybe they might be amended. In the U.S., you have, let's say, the Bill of Rights. In Canada, we have the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and typically they have to be the Constitution. If it gets amended, let's just say, it has to be ratified by much more than just a plurality or a majority of the legislative branch, or the House of Commons. Typically, you have to get, like, let's say 2/3, or you have to have all the provinces ratify it. So that's kind of our top source of law, and all statutes have to comply with the Constitution. Then we have legislation that's passed by either the Congress in the US, or you have the House of Commons and the Senate in Canada. So an example that applies to us would be the Aeronautics Act, of course. And then we have administrative regulations. So in our case, that would be the Canadian aviation regulations. And those are put in force by the regulatory body. So in our case, Transport Canada. And then the other source of law that most people don't think about is court decisions or case law, right? So that's how we interpret various laws. And so that's an important source of law that lawyers often look to as well, is they know what the statute says, but then how should it be interpreted? So let's begin and talk about the Constitution of Canada. So the Constitution of Canada is the supreme law of the land of the Dominion of Canada. It is subject to interpretation by the judicial branch. So that's the courts. They will often interpret the Constitution. Now, applying this to pilots, rarely does the operation of aircraft touch on constitutional issues. But we will talk about those rare exceptions in a little bit. So, contrary to popular belief, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms is not the Canadian Constitution. It is one of the constitutional documents in Canada, but there's many other documents that form our Constitution. So starting with the Constitution Act in 1867, it sets out, amongst other things, which branches of government are responsible for what, and it dictates the peace, order, and good government, the POG clause it's called. And then in 1982, when Pierre Trudeau repatriated the Constitution, we had the Constitution Act 1982, which stated that no British acts applied to Canada. And at the same time, we had the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which sets out the rights and freedoms that each Canadian can enjoy. And then you also have things like the Manitoba Act, Alberta Act, things like that. Acts like that. They're also given constitutional muster. And then lastly, there's things like the British Convention, royal prerogative, like what the Governor General does and how they carry about their business, and unwritten principles that also form part of the Constitution of Canada. But that's pretty far above what we want to get into, so we'll leave that to the law students. So let's go back all the way to the founding of Canada, the Constitution Act 1867. And we'll talk about division of powers. So often lawyers, they'll talk about this as like classical constitutional law. So the constitutional law that was around before you had the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And this is actually where aviation law gets really interesting. And the reason for that is because there's some interesting carve outs in the law for aviation. Aviation kind of gets its own little nook and cranny of Canadian law. It's like a carve out from what you would think would be common sense or the way things should be done. Aviation gets a bit of a carve out from it. So with division of powers, you could spend like a good chunk of your legal career discussing division of powers constitutional law. It's really massive. And actually, interestingly enough, a lot of the division of powers constitutional law got developed as a result of prohibition and alcohol and things like that when the U.S. was going through prohibition and can we do that? What branch of government can regulate a drinking establishment, for example? Okay, so like we said, the Constitution Act of 1867 set out the division of powers framework, and so in that it says that the federal government's responsible for things like national defense and maritime issues. So, for example, like the province of Ontario can't make their own military and say, okay, this is like the Royal Ontario Military or Armed Forces or something like that. That's exclusively under the federal domain. And then likewise, the provincial governments are responsible for other things like education, property rights, and things like that. So in the US, for example, you have a Department of Education, part of the federal government. And in Canada, obviously, you don't. We don't have a federal Department of Education or Ministry of Education. And in Canada, generally, one branch of government cannot interfere with the duties of other branches. Now, there's, always exceptions to the rule and things like that. And so, for an example, the federal government can't start taking control of schools, setting out curricula and things like that. With the exception, I guess, of like schools on First Nations. I guess the federal government takes care of that, but that's a completely different kettle of fish. So we're not going to go into there. So here, sorry, I jumped ahead on my last slide here. I started talking about this a bit early. So generally one branch of government can't trample on the subjects assigned to the other level of governments. So you can't have a provincial government make their own army. The federal government, the recent example, can't create their national securities regulator to regulate stocks. It's like the Ontario Securities Commission. It's strictly provincial. And then on the flip side, provincial governments cannot impair aviation. So we're going to talk about that quite a bit more. So let's go back all the way to 1954, and this is kind of when aviation jurisprudence, so case law, got started in Canada that relates to aviation. So this case was like called Johansson, okay, and it's kind of like the first big case involving aviation in Canada. So this fellow named Mr. Johansson, he was in Manitoba and he wanted to build an airstrip. And the municipality said, nah, not so fast. You're not building an airstrip. We're not going to let you build an airstrip. And like if we're honest about it, we don't know anything about division of powers constitutional law in Canada, we would probably say like, yeah, that's reasonable, right? Like you can't just make an aerodrome out of your back field and then everyone else has to listen to your airplanes take care of that. However, this went all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada, and the Supreme Court of Canada held that aeronautics falls under the peace, order, and good government clause of the Constitution. So they read in aeronautics. Obviously, aeronautics was not a thing in 1867. So they read it in and they said, this is part of our Constitution now. And they held that aviation is therefore under the exclusive jurisdiction of the federal government. So, since Johansson, a long line of Supreme Court decisions have held that provincial laws cannot impair aviation. So, for example, municipal bylaws preventing aerodromes from operating are ultra vires, which means beyond the powers of, and are therefore invalid. And the Supreme Court case of that is Sacré-Cœur from Quebec. So, in that case, um, somebody wanted to make a float um, wanted to make a float base by their lake, and then the municipality said, no, you're not going to do that. We made a bylaw against that, and that bylaw was held to be invalid by the Supreme Court of Canada. Uh, Similarly, environmental laws that impair aviation are inapplicable to aviation. So, for example, if a provincial government makes an environmental law that says, yeah, it's too noisy, for example, you can't have power boats, you can't have airplanes, that sort of thing. Well, the power boats, the law is still valid. They can still do that. However, it would be inapplicable to aviation. So that case was called COPA about 12 years ago or something like that. And municipal building codes do not apply to aviation. So that's a GTAA case from probably 15 years ago or so. However, you can't use these arguments to avoid regulation. Okay, so you can't turn your airport into an aggregate storage facility. So this happened in Burlington Airpark a few years ago. They said, well, you know what? There's a lot of environmental paperwork that has to be done if somebody wants to dump gravel somewhere, let's just say, right? So you had all these construction companies that had to dump gravel somewhere, and it cost a lot of money to get all the permits. So Burlington Airpark just threw all the gravel on their property and said, hey, yeah, we'll charge you, we'll make some money by you put your gravel here, and we're an airport, so you can't, um, the permits don't apply. And so in the end, it did end up applying because it was kind of seen as a regulatory avoidance type of thing. It didn't really have much. They claimed, the Burlington Airport claimed that they were going to be building a runway and they needed this for a runway, but the evidence showed that no, they were just doing this to skirt laws. You still have provincial workplace safety standards and minimum wage laws that apply to aviation. Okay, so that's and then you still have to pay your taxes. You can't just say, okay, well, I'm not going to owe any money on I'm not going to pay any property taxes on my airport because that would impair aviation. That's not how it works either. Okay? And so just because a provincial law touches on aviation, it may still be applicable. Okay, so the point where it becomes inapplicable is when it starts impairing the core of aeronautics, and you have to have evidence of that impairment. So, like I said before, like for example, the minimum wage laws, right? That doesn't really impair aviation because a construction company has to pay their workers a reasonable wage. It doesn't impair aviation, but it certainly would impair it if you say, okay, well, there is no aircraft allowed on this lake, for example. Well, now you're shutting the whole thing down. So let's talk about some charter issues, specifically Section 8 search and seizure. And most pilots are not familiar with this, kind of what Transport Canada has the right to do and what they don't have the right to do. So most people are familiar with searches in kind of a criminal context, like the police. The police can't just show up at your house and say, we want to walk around your house and look for guns and drugs. All right, they need a warrant, of course, before they can do that. However, Transport Canada, a Transport Canada inspector can identify themselves and say, we'd like to search your airplane. We want to look at your pilot's license. We want to look at your insurance things. And that is perfectly legal. It's in the Aeronautics Act. And there is an important difference. And the important difference is that the police can remove your liberty. They can arrest you. They can send you to jail if they find a gun. Where Transport Canada doesn't have that right. They can't arrest you. They can't send you to jail. They can give you a fine or remove your license, but that's about it. So that's why there's that difference, because it's not unreasonable that the regulatory agencies can look at something and enforce the laws when there's no legal or jeopardy of losing your liberty and going to jail. So generally, the police require a search warrant, And generally speaking, Transport Canada does not require a search warrant. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. So in the Aeronautics Act, Section 8.7, an inspector, so that would be a Transport Canada inspector, can enter any aircraft premises and seize documents as part of audits and investigations. And the inspector can enter any place for the purpose of aviation safety. And the inspector in CAR 10302, the CARs say that inspector can inspect these documents and aircraft with reasonable notice. So let's just say you run a company. An inspector can say, okay, in a week I'm going to come by for an inspection, and I'd like you to have all your documents ready. If they just show up day of, well, that's not really reasonable notice. You can say, yeah, we'll get those documents to you right away, but it's going to take us a week to get them together. So there's something interesting in the Supreme Court case called R. N. Jarvis in 2002, and this had to do with Revenue Canada, so tax law, not aviation, but there was some overlaps. Okay, and so inspectors relinquish administrative search powers when the inquiry in question engages the adversarial relationship between the individual and the state. Okay, so what that means is that when, let's say, Transport Canada, or in this R. N. Jarvis case, Revenue Canada, they're just looking for, or they're just doing compliance things. They're just making sure you're following the rules. They can ask you for your documents, come and take a look at them. But then there'll be a certain point where it's no longer an administrative issue. It could very well be a legal issue or a criminal issue. So, for example, Revenue Canada, they're looking through things which they're allowed doing, making sure you paid your taxes. And now all of a sudden it's no longer, well, you didn't file his taxes correctly. Now all of a sudden it's, you know what, he's probably evading taxes. Like this could be criminal. And then at that point, the state, the government has to go and they have to actually get a warrant. They can't keep searching and then use that as evidence when they believe that there's been some criminal activity taking place. So one of the recent cases in 2019 was the Minister of Transport versus Coulson Air Crane that went before the Transportation Appeal Tribunal of Canada. And journey log was excluded when Transport Canada used heavy-handed methods in their investigations and seized docs without a warrant during an investigation. So there's quite a bit to this story. According to the judgment, there was a former employee that wasn't too happy with Coulson Air Crane. Former employee happened to be friends with the Transport Canada inspector, and then the Transport Canada inspector used his administrative search powers without a warrant to go and seize some documents. And this, I believe, went to an appeal, and it was upheld that this journey log evidence was excluded because if they were going to do that, they needed to get a warrant. This was beyond just an administrative inspection. Let's talk about the pilot in command. So we're done with charter issues. That was just kind of like a real brief overview, and let's talk about what the pilot in command is. So the pilot in command means, in relation to an aircraft, the pilot having responsibility and authority for the operation and safety of the aircraft during flight. Interestingly enough, the pilot in command has powers of arrest. That's in the criminal code. And so this is when the aircraft is in flight. So it doesn't mean that you're a pilot in command and you can just walk through an airport and arrest somebody. But when you are in flight, let's just say you're a captain of a large jet and somebody gets rowdy in the back and you believe they have committed a criminal offense, you can arrest them just same as a police officer could. So when I made these slides, I was looking for some pictures to make these slides a bit more interesting and not so boring. So, and I couldn't find anything of a pilot arresting somebody, and I thought I wish I could, but I couldn't find it. So then I turned to DALL-E 2. I don't know if you're familiar with DALL-E 2. It's a stable diffusion AI platform that makes pictures. So I typed in something like photorealistic picture of a pilot arresting somebody. And usually when you do this, you get like really cool pictures and it looks like a real photograph. In this case, unfortunately, it didn't do a really good job this kind of mangled captain is looks like groping this woman in a miniskirt with a fake pilot outfit on. So I know this isn't like really part of this lesson, but I found it really kind of funny how bad it was because normally it's really good. And then we have this guy, he's throwing somebody on like an egg-shaped airplane. And then here we have some other guy. This guy looks like a female version of like Gaddafi sitting on somebody's lap. I'm not quite sure what this is all about. And then on the right side, again, it's absolutely terrible. But I thought it was really funny, and so I thought I'd throw it out there and include it in the video. And if you're offended by the rapey picture on the last slide of the pilot arresting the girl in the pilot girl in the miniskirt, sorry, but I thought it was funny. So let's talk a bit more about the pilot command. So the pilot command has the ultimate authority over the safety of the flight. So the decision to take any action, emergency action, is one that rests entirely with the captain and no one else. And that was from the TATC, the Zaouch decision. Let's talk about criminal code things. So criminal negligence would be kind of the one that would come up for pilots. So normally when we talk about negligence in the civil context, so this would be like you're driving your car and you weren't really paying attention, you end up rear-ending somebody, right? So you were negligent. So you're not going to go to jail. You might get a fine, but you're not going to go to jail about this. It's not criminal. It's just you were negligent, and you or your insurance company might have to pay the person that was injured some money. So negligence has the following elements. So there's a duty of care, a breach of the duty of care, and the party that suffered damages that were proximate to this breach. So let's just go through that. So when you're driving your car, for example, you have a duty of care to pedestrians and to other drivers. And if you might do something that would breach this duty of care without being criminal, but you didn't follow the standard of care. So maybe you were driving the speed limit when it was like black ice out and you should have slowed down a bit below. And then all of a sudden you find yourself, you've rear-ended somebody in the car in front of you. Okay. And they end up with whiplash. They have to take a couple weeks off work because they're injured. So those damages were proximate to the breach. Okay. So you breached your duty of care and they got a headache. Now let's just say that person had a pre-existing condition, for example. Well, it could be that, yes, you breached the duty of care. Yes, they suffered damages, but the damages were more of a result of their pre-existing medical condition than it was something else. Now, let's add an additional element, mens rea, in the criminal context. And so that means like a guilty mind. So you can have negligence, like I just talked about with the rear-ending somebody, and then you can have criminal negligence. So now at this point, your actions are so egregious that you knew that what you were doing was wrong. So the person who's driving a bit too fast with black ice didn't really know what they were doing was wrong. They weren't speeding, let's just say. It was just an accident because of lapse in judgment. But now we're talking about somebody who knows that what they were doing was wrong. So here's a couple of examples that have been upheld by the criminal courts as criminal negligence. So in one case, this happened, I believe, in Fort Good Hope, Northwest Territories, around the same time I was up there 25 years ago. Okay, so back in the day when before there were cameras on the phones, people had like Sony Handycams, right, where you closed one eye and stuck your other eye in an eyepiece and looked out. And so this guy was flying, I think it's Cessna 207, and his buddy's on the ground, and he wants to do a flyby, and he thinks it would be cool to fly like really low to his buddy and get like a really, really good video. And unfortunately, because the photographer, the videographer, one eye's closed, the other one's in an eyepiece, this plane comes at him, and well, unfortunately, this wheel hits the videographer in the head and kills him, and he dies. So in this case, you know, he wasn't just negligent. It wasn't just an accident. It was so egregious. He flew so low and so dangerously that he killed somebody. And so he ended up being convicted of criminal negligence causing death. And then in another case in Winnipeg, the Telford decisions, maybe 10, 15 years ago or so, the pilot took off knowing that they had insufficient fuel. So it wasn't like he miscalculated. He knew he wasn't going to have enough fuel. And then he ran out of fuel on short final, ended up crashing in the middle of the city of Winnipeg, and it killed one person. So that person, again, was convicted of criminal negligence causing death. So you can understand the difference here between somebody who is criminally negligent and somebody who's just negligent because they just had a lapse in judgment. Let's talk about the Canadian aviation regulations. So you don't have to memorize all these regulations, but you should be familiar with where to find the different cars. So in part 1, we have our definitions. Part 2, registration. We go to part 4. That's where you're going to have your licensing and training requirements. And so standard 421 is the requirements for licenses. So if you're a flight instructor, you definitely need to know where to find that. And then part 6 is usually what we are most familiar with, the operating flight rules, what you need for like VFR weather minima. And then car 605, you have your aircraft equipment. And then the standard 625. So whenever you have a car, you have like 605, 604, and then the standard is they added 20 onto it. So 625 would be like your equipment standards. For example, what maintenance you have to do on the aircraft. And then part 7 is your commercial operations. So 700 applies to all commercial standards. 702 specialty air service. 703 is air taxi. So the first big one that most people should be familiar with is car 60201. No person shall operate an aircraft in such a reckless or negligent manner as to endanger or be likely to endanger the life or property of any person. This can actually also be a criminal charge, so criminal negligence. But this is not when it's so bad that it's criminal. This is just you did something stupid, and we'll talk about that before. It's also a bit of a catch-all. A lot of the stupid things are caught in the regulations, right? Like low flying, for example, is captured in the regulations. But this is like, yeah, we couldn't find anything else to get you with, but what you did was pretty dumb, and you endangered somebody, or it was likely to endanger somebody. So we're going to get you on that. So let's talk about the individual words. So you have negligence, right? Because it talks about negligence or reckless, right? So the Black's Law Dictionary defines negligence as the failure to exercise the standard of care that a reasonably prudent person would have exercised in a similar situation. And so any conduct that falls below this legal standard established to protect others against unreasonable risk of harm, except for conduct that is intentionally, wantonly, or willfully disregardful of others' rights. And then we have reckless, and that's conduct whereby an actor does not desire harmful consequences, but nonetheless foresees the possibility and consciously takes that risk. So it's greater fault than negligence, but less fault than intentional wrongdoing. So there's a few of these cases that are worth talking about. So what exactly is negligent or reckless operation of an aircraft? So we'll just talk about some cases that came before the Transportation Appeal Tribunal of Canada. So the first off, for a hazard to be created, the chance of an accident, the risk or peril or the exposure or danger must be real. Okay, so what that means is that you can't be doing something and it's like, well, if somebody was there or it could have been, or it's conjecture. There has to be a real risk. There has to be somebody involved. Like you have to be able to point to somebody and say, okay, you put this person's life in jeopardy. It could have been somebody's life. Okay, so one of these videos, there's this fellow named Friesen, and this case got appealed, then went to the Federal Court of Canada, I think twice. Like it went through like 6 or 7 different hearings. Like it was nuts how much it is. So this Friesen fellow, he's a helicopter pilot and he's a YouTuber, considerably more successful than I am and makes far more exciting videos than I do. And so he made this, let's be honest, it was a pretty cool video of him landing his helicopter with some hockey players on a mountain lake. It's beautiful cinematography. And then as they're skating on this mountain lake, he's chasing them with the helicopter and he's got all these cool shots and things like that, right? So great video. unfortunately, it was reckless, right? The people on the ground, who knows what could have happened if they fall, he runs over them or he hits them with a rotor blade. Who knows? But anyway, the Transportation Appeal Tribunal held that he was reckless doing this. And so he ended up either with a fine or a license suspension. And that got upheld by the federal court. In another example, this Belfleur character, he took a passenger flying and he decided to shut his engine off on final. I don't know why, to show off or what. But anyway, that was it was considered that he was reckless towards the passenger that he had. Now, on the other hand, or sorry, and then another a pilot, he had a float plane. He took off about 25 feet over a boat. So he was negligent. He was too close to the boat, even though he didn't. It was a bit worse than just low flying. It was like he could have hit this boat. On the other hand, in one case, a pilot landing at a restaurant with his helicopter was not negligent. This was a helicopter pilot, and he was in Winnipeg. He wanted to go out, and there was a field beside the restaurant or a parking lot, and he just landed in the parking lot, and and he got brought before the Transportation Appeal Tribunal, and the member held that he was not negligent because there was nobody really that he put in danger. There was nobody in the parking lot. There's nobody in the field. So the case against in another case, Drader in Canada, an experienced helicopter pilot, he flew 10 to 15 meters from a car that was suspected of theft to get the license plate number, and that was not considered negligent. And neither was a helicopter pilot that hover taxied his helicopter within 30 feet of another aircraft on a congested ramp. That was also dismissed by back in the day, the Civil Aviation Tribunal, which is the forerunner of the TATC. So that's not considered negligent. Um, let's talk about low flight. This one gets a lot of people because a lot of people like flying low for obvious reasons because they think it's fun, whatever, and until something bad happens or you get reported. So 602.13, no person shall conduct a takeoff, approach, or landing in an aircraft within a built-up area of a city or town unless the takeoff, approach, or landing is conducted at an airport, heliport, or military aerodrome. So the exception is there's an exception for medevac or police. So the operative words here are like city or town. Okay, so just because you have a farmer's field that's like right at the edge of a town doesn't mean you can fly over the town to land there. And often you'll see helicopters and they're landing somewhere just for sightseeing, and you can't do that either. Just because it's a helicopter doesn't exempt you for this. However, being a medevac or police operation does, you get an exception from this. And so next one, 602.15, a person may operate an aircraft at altitudes and distances less than those specified, so less than the built-up area, where the aircraft is operated at altitudes and distances that are no less than necessary for purpose of operation of the aircraft, which the aircraft is engaged. The aircraft is operated without creating a hazard or persons or property on the surface, and the aircraft is operated purpose of police, saving human life, air ambulance, yada, yada, yada. Okay, so those are your exceptions that you're allowed. But notice here, this is built up area. There is no exception for survey flying or flight training in the built up area, only for police, saving life, that sort of thing. So now let's talk about those other things, aerial application, photography, flight training. Okay, so a person may operate an aircraft to the extent necessary for the purpose of the operation in which the aircraft is engaged at altitudes less than the distances set up in blah, 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 which are non-built up areas. So now all of a sudden you're kind of over farm fields. It's not built up. So you can do aerial photography, aerial application, or flight training. Okay, so you might be wondering, it's like, what is a built-up area? And a built-up area is generally seen as a collection of man-made structures. So it is not, contrary to popular belief, it is not the definition, the legal definition of built-up area is not the yellow areas on your VNC. But it should be pretty obvious what's a built-up area. Like if you're flying and you're over farmland and there's farmhouses and barns, that's not a built-up area. But if you're in a rural area and you're flying over a small town, that is considered a built-up area. So talking about some of the decisions from the TATC. So if you're flying in bad weather, that's not a defense for low flying over built up area. You can't just say, oh, yeah, the weather got so bad, so I had to fly 100 feet over this city. No, you should have turned around or done something else. So that's not an excuse. Okay. Um, and a balloon landing in a built-up area is not a CARS contravention. In this case, I mean, it's probably pretty specific because it was a precautionary measure. Pilot probably felt that something had to do something and get on the ground as quick as possible. Okay, and um, you can't claim an exemption for taking off or landing to deviate from the circuit and fly lower of a boat. So this again is pretty specific, but this Prudhomme fellow probably was doing circuits, saw a boat, thought he'd do a buzz job, and then said, "Hey, I was just doing takeoff and landing." It's like, no, that's not really the point of it. That's not what we're doing. Okay. So let's talk about a commercial air service because this is probably within the cars. A breach of these regulations is probably one of the more serious things that you can do. So, for example, you have a private pilot's license, you have your own airplane, and all of a sudden you say, "Hey, for $200, I'll take you sightseeing, or I'll take you somewhere." That'll get you in a lot of trouble really quickly. Because you don't have insurance for it, there's no operational control, you probably don't know what you're doing. So we'll start with some definitions. So definition of an air service: commercial air service means the use means any use of an aircraft for hire or reward. Okay, so reward is a pretty broad term. So it's defined later. Means any payment, consideration, gratuity, or benefit directly or indirectly charged, demanded, received, or collected by any person for the use of an aircraft. So um, obviously, I give you $200 to fly me somewhere. Well, that's a payment. That's higher reward. But also, I you can't fly me somewhere and I say, well, if you fly me to Toronto, I will build you a deck. Uh, so that's not that's higher reward as well. And then as well, it can go even further than that. You can't say, okay, well, it's a free flight, but this helps with business. So for example, we'll talk about this later, but like I'm a real estate agent and I fly a client to go look at a house. Well, I didn't charge you to you to look at a house in your airplane, but there's a pretty good chance you might keep giving me your business because I flew you somewhere, and that price probably gets tacked into my commission that I might get. So next definition: air transport service means a commercial air service that is operated for the purpose of transporting persons, personal belongings, baggage, goods, and cargo in an aircraft between 2 points. Then we have a flight training service, which is a commercial air service that is operated for the purpose of conducting flight training. We have aerial work, which is a commercial air service other than an air transport service or flight training service. So if you recall, air transport services between 2 points, well, aerial work and flight training services, flight training, obviously. So then we have other commercial services, right? That it called aerial work. So, for example, parachute jumping would be aerial work, right? You're not flying people between 2 points, but you're not training them either. But it is commercial because you're charging them to fly them in the air. Then we have specialty air services. So that's aerial mapping, surveying, photography, forest fire management, firefighting, aerial advertising, glider towing, parachute jumping, aerial construction, heli logging, aerial sightseeing, flight training, aerial inspection, surveillance, and aerial spraying services. So those are all considered specialty air services. So let's talk generally about operation of a commercial air service. So 700, car 700.02, no person shall operate an air transport service unless the person holds and complies with the provisions of a air operator certificate that authorizes the person to operate that service. So remember, the air transport service is between 2 points, right? Okay, so then the next one: no person shall, unless the person holds and complies with the provisions of an air operator certificate, to conduct aerial work involving carriage uh, of the carriage on board of persons other than flight crew members, carriage of helicopters B, C, D, external loads, towing of objects, or the dispersal of products. So this relates to car 702, and so This is, for example, carriage of persons on board other than flight crew members. So you're not flying people between 2 points, like we said. We are flying, let's just say, parachute jumpers. Or for the another example, you are flying uh, people who aren't necessarily passengers, but they're spotters. They're looking at, you're doing some aerial survey work and they are spotters. So that would be 702. And so then there are also exceptions to this for farmers crop spraying, which we won't really get into, and flight training unit sightseeing. So now let's talk about what a private pilot can do. Like when can they get money? Because they can get money sometimes, okay? But there are very tight conditions that are set out. So the holder of a private pilot license shall not act as a pilot in command for higher reward unless the conditions set out below are met. So the holder of a private pilot license can receive reimbursement for costs incurred in respect of a flight if the holder is the owner or operator of the aircraft. So you can't borrow somebody else's aircraft and do it and then get money back. You have to be the guy that owns the plane. Um, and you conduct the flight for purposes other than the higher reward. So you're not doing this to make money. You just need to get some money reimbursement. And you carry passengers only incidentally to the purposes of the flight. And I'll talk about that in a sec here. And then you receive reimbursement that's provided only by passengers for the purpose of sharing costs of fuel, oil, and fees charged against the aircraft. So what this means in general, and especially the incidental, is let's just say I'm like, hey, I'm going to Ottawa. I'm flying to Ottawa. And some guy's like, oh, I need to go to Ottawa. Can I come with you? And I'm like, yeah, sure. And hey, how about we split the cost? And that's totally legal and that's okay to do. However, if I put out an ad or I'm like, hey, where do you want to go? And the person's like, hey, I need to go to Ottawa. And I'm like, okay, here you go. Here's your bill, or here, we'll split the cost after you've decided where we're going to go. Well, that's not legal. But if you're going to the same spot and you want to split the cost, by all means, fill your boots. So here's another one. The holder of a private pilot may receive reimbursement from the holder's employer for costs incurred in respect of a flight if you're employed on a full-time basis by the employer for purposes other than flying. Okay, so let's just say you're a repairman of some sort, um, and that's your full-time job, but you have to fly somewhere. So you're not employed as a pilot. For that, you have to be a commercial pilot. Um, and you're flying and you're conducting the flight on the employer's business and the flight is incidental to your duties. So your duties are not to fly the aircraft, and you receive a reimbursement basically that doesn't exceed the cost of flying. Okay. So if you want to rent the aircraft or you own the aircraft, you can't make extra money on it if you are employed. And then, of course, a private pilot may receive reimbursement from a charitable or not-for-profit organization for a flight conducted as a volunteer. Uh, and you can earn a profit. So this is, for example, air cadets. I've done this before. Familiarization flights. You can rent an airplane, and the air cadets pay for the rental, and you fly them around. The other organizations, the Civil Air Search and Rescue Association, when they look for downed aircraft. So that's Casera. That's a public security organization, and they'll pay owners some money to fly the aircraft around. So this has come up quite a bit before the Transportation Appeal Tribunal of Canada. Basically, if there's a financial benefit, it's a commercial air service. Okay, so examples are like a free flight to a fishing lodge. You can't say, okay, well, it's $500 a day to the fishing lodge, and the flight is free. Well, no, because if you didn't make it a free flight, you'd have a cheaper price, right? If the flight wasn't included. So that has to be done through a commercial air service, or as I mentioned earlier, a real estate agent giving a free tour of prospective island properties in a float plane. But actually, if you go through the definitions, not all commercial air services require an air operating certificate. You can actually work, quote unquote, work for hire or reward, so to speak, fly an aircraft, earn money doing it without it contravening the law. So, for example, aerial photography, when nobody else is on board, you're the guy taking a picture. So you're flying your little Cessna 150 around, snap some picture of people, properties and then go and try to sell it to them. There's a pretty large company actually that does this. They don't have an air operating certificate. They do that. Um, if you are offering another service and flying yourself, so important thing is not your clients to a location. So for example, um, I know a couple people. A friend of mine, he's a lawyer, and he doesn't fly his clients. So if he flew his clients, that would most likely not be legal because there'd be a financial benefit to him flying it. But yeah, he goes and services, does court cases all over the province, and then he flies himself there, and then he sends a bill to the for his time and for the aircraft to his clients. Another guy I know, he's a boat mechanic. He just has his own float plane, flies up to cottage country, fixes people's boats, and then charges them travel time, just like he would charge in his pickup truck. Let's say if he drove there. You could also fly your own goods somewhere and sell them out of the back of your airplane. Yeah, you can't take pre-orders and fly people's goods. That would be an air transport service that would require an AOC. But you can buy your own stuff and then fly them somewhere yourself and sell them once you're in that location. You could also have your own airplane for consulting work and fly yourself. So no passengers or cargo to remote locations, collect samples, field work, things like that. So that's all I've got for you for advanced air law. I hope you are not terribly bored. I hope this was a learning experience and you are somewhat a bit more excited to learn how aviation law works. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next lesson. Thanks.